You've arrived. Not because you pushed through a locked door, not because you suffered long enough to be rewarded, not because some invisible authority finally stamped your file with the word ready. You've arrived because something inside you stopped arguing with the moment you were already in. The fight didn't end with fireworks. It ended the way storms end, when the air pressure equalizes quietly, almost without a trace. One day you simply noticed you were not bracing as hard, not scanning as obsessively, not constructing a case for why you should be somewhere else, someone else further along. You've arrived because the resistance that used to run in the background like static has softened. The constant questioning, is this right? Is this enough? Am I missing something? Doesn't have the same grip. The endless seeking, the urge to understand everything before you dare to move, has gone quiet enough for something else to be heard. And in that quiet, something remarkable becomes possible. You are ready to receive. This is easy to miss because readiness does not announce itself. There is no ceremonial threshold, no blinding revelation, no voice from the heavens congratulating you for getting it. There's no certificate handed down by the universe. Most of the time, the only evidence is almost disappointingly simple. You find yourself here reading, listening, being present, and there is no urgency in you. No frantic need to squeeze meaning out of every line. No anxiety that you might misunderstand the point and miss your chance. That absence of pressure is not emptiness. It is the sign that your system has stabilized enough to let information land without creating turbulence. And it matters to say this clearly because your mind might still be conditioned to dramatize the moment. Nothing is being downloaded into you. There is no secret transmission crossing dimensions to reach your consciousness. No special activation, no coded frequency, no external force entering you like a lightning bolt. What has changed is not what exists around you. What has changed is your capacity to hold what has been here the entire time. For months, maybe years, your inner state has been like water that could not settle. Every thought created ripples. Every emotion sent waves across your awareness. Every interpretation pulled you into motion again. In a body and mind like that, clarity cannot form, not because clarity is withheld, but because it cannot rest. Insight cannot land, not because you are unworthy, but because the surface is constantly disturbed. When the field is unstable, everything skitters. Every message becomes noise, not because the message is wrong, but because the receiver is shaking. Then something shifted. Maybe you can't name the exact moment. Maybe it happened so gradually that there was no single turning point. Your attention stopped lurching forward into the worry of what comes next. It stopped yanking itself backward into regret about what already happened. It started to rest where it actually is, here in this present moment, without needing to escape it, perfect it, or outrun it. The mind that used to time travel as a survival strategy is learning stillness, not as an achievement, but as a baseline. This is what we're calling the healing phase, though that word can be misleading. It can make it sound like you were broken. You weren't. You've never been broken. What has been fragmented is not your value, but your observational field, the lens through which you experience reality. Your attention has been split into pieces so often for so long that wholeness started to feel unfamiliar. And now, for the first time in a long time, it is becoming whole again. Not because you fixed it, but because you stopped disturbing it. There is a principle here that can sound mystical, but it is actually practical. The field of reality does not respond to how badly you want something. It does not respond to your effort, your self-judgment, your worthiness, or how many affirmations you have repeated. It responds to one thing: the stability of your presence. When your presence fragments under pressure, reality is experienced as fragmented. When your presence holds steady, reality can finally show you what has been there all along. Not because the world changed overnight, but because you stopped scrambling the signal you were trying to read. Most people bypass this phase entirely. They are waiting for something bigger, something more dramatic, something that matches their expectations of what transformation should feel like. They want the lightning bolt moment. They want the tears. They want to feel overwhelmed in a way they can point to and say, this is it. This is the shift. And because they are waiting for that, they walk right past the subtle recalibration that is actually doing the work. They mistake quiet for nothing. They confuse the absence of intensity with the absence of movement. But you are still here. And if these words are landing without creating a compulsive need to act, fix, chase, or prove anything, then you are in a different position than you were before. You have crossed an invisible threshold, not into a new rank, not into a spiritual status, not into some elevated identity, into readiness. The readiness to receive what you've been asking for without collapsing under its weight. Reality doesn't send you what you can't hold. It isn't withholding blessings to test your patience. It isn't punishing you with delays. It is simply a system of coherence. When something arrives and your field is unstable, it scatters. It cannot integrate. It becomes another event you have to manage, interpret, and survive. But when your field stabilizes, what arrives can land and stay. It can become part of you instead of another thing you wrestle with. So the healing phase begins not because you are finally starting to heal, but because you are stable enough to let healing complete itself. There's a difference between healing as an activity and healing as a completion. Most people are stuck in healing as effort, always working, always processing, always chasing the feeling of being done. Completion happens when the interference stops, when the system no longer needs to break itself in order to feel in control. This is the question most people never ask: what happens when the observer stops breaking itself? Look at how you may have moved through life until now. Every time something uncertain appeared, your attention fractured. One part of you jumped ahead, trying to predict outcomes so you could protect yourself. Another part pulled backward, searching the past for patterns so you could avoid repeating pain. Another part froze, analyzing whether you were safe enough to proceed. Even in moments that looked calm from the outside, there may have been a constant splitting within. And that splitting creates the sensation of being stuck, confused, overwhelmed, unable to move even when you want to. A fragmented field cannot respond cleanly. It needs a unified point of observation. Not a perfect one, not saintly one, not an enlightened one, just a point that isn't constantly dividing itself against itself. When that unity forms, even briefly, reality begins to reorganize around it. Not because you are manifesting with special powers, but because you stopped introducing static into your own signal. You didn't become magical, you became coherent. Most of the noise you have experienced did not come from external circumstances. The outside world is loud, yes, but what made it unbearable was the internal collapse and rebuild cycle happening many times per minute. Each collapse distorted the signal. Each rebuild tried to compensate. And in that continuous churn, clarity was impossible. You weren't receiving garbled messages from life. You were receiving clear messages through a receiver that could not hold still. Now the receiver has steadied, not through force, not through perfect practice, not through a flawless technique. Often it steadies through exhaustion, the honest kind. You got tired of maintaining fragmentation, tired of holding yourself together through control, tired of monitoring every thought and emotion as if you were managing a volatile machine that might explode if you looked away. And in that fatigue, something in you loosened. You accidentally let go of the very thing that was creating instability. What you notice first is not spiritual spectacle. You notice a change in rhythm. There is a pause now, small, almost imperceptible, between something happening and your reaction to it. You do not manufacture this pause through discipline. It appears when the compulsion to immediately interpret everything begins to fade. In that pause, the healing phase does its work. Not just healing from trauma, though that may unfold too, but healing from the habit of self-interference. You are no longer rushing to understand, no longer rushing to decide, no longer rushing to make meaning out of every sensation, every thought, every moment of uncertainty. The mind that once demanded instant answers to feel safe has gone quiet enough to allow actual information through. And actual information rarely arrives as a dramatic story. It arrives as knowing complete wordless, requiring no explanation. It does not insist on being performed. It does not demand an audience. It simply is. When your field stabilizes, you begin to recognize that there are channels through which the stabilized observer receives. They are not mystical rewards. They are natural functions that become available when the system is not constantly tearing itself apart. The first channel is cognitive awareness, clean knowing. Information arrives whole, no buildup, no dramatic figuring out, no frantic dot connecting. You suddenly know something you did not know before, and that knowing is calm, almost boring. It doesn't produce urgency. It doesn't require you to change your identity around it. It sits there stable, available whenever you need to reference it. Many people dismiss this because they have been conditioned to value emotional knowing, the kind that comes with chills, tears, a sense of significance. But emotional intensity is not a reliable measure of truth. Emotional intensity is often what happens when the mind doesn't trust the information yet and tries to persuade itself through drama. Clean cognitive awareness doesn't need persuasion. It doesn't need your adrenaline. It doesn't need your performance. It is simply true enough to remain quiet. The second channel is spatial awareness. This one is harder to describe because it doesn't operate in words or images. It operates in felt geometry. You sense structure, relationship, distance, alignment. Something that felt open yesterday now feels closed. And you can't justify it rationally. A decision you were agonizing over suddenly has no weight, and there's no narrative explaining why. A person, a path, a commitment, something in your life rearranges itself internally, and you feel the coherence or incoherence as a shift in the internal landscape. This is not intuition as a mystical personality trait. It is pattern recognition operating below conscious thought. Your system reads coherence in real-time alignment and misalignment, and it communicates through expansion and contraction. Not emotional expansion, not emotional contraction. Structural, like a door quietly opening, like a hinge quietly closing. It does not shout. It orients you. The third channel is boundary awareness, the rarest and most misunderstood. It appears in liminal spaces, the edges of sleep, deep rest moments, when the body releases while consciousness stays clear. There is no theatrical separation, no leaving the body, no escapist fantasy. Just a recognition. Awareness does not require the same level of physiological activation you thought it did. You can be deeply relaxed, nearly asleep, and still fully present. This continuity of awareness across states is the sign the observer is no longer collapsing. The system doesn't drop awareness the way it used to. It doesn't black out and rebuild. It remains continuous. And here's the irony: the moment someone tries to grasp this, to turn it into an achievement, to make it happen on demand, it disappears. Because this channel only opens when there is no grasping, no trying, no effort to maintain it. It is pure allowing. And allowing cannot be practiced in the usual sense. It can only be permitted. These channels are not hierarchical. You don't level up from one to the next. They are different ways stable presence receives information. Some days cognitive knowing dominates. Other days you live primarily through spatial sense. Sometimes boundary awareness flickers in and out like a quiet light. You happen to notice. None of this needs to be tracked. None of it needs to become a project. The only question is whether the foundation stays stable when the channels open. And you need discernment here, because not every intense sensation belongs to these channels. The mind is brilliant at generating experiences that feel significant. Vivid imagery, emotional surges, bodily sensations that seem meaningful. These can be the nervous system processing old patterns. They can be the imagination filling gaps. They can be the ego creating drama to preserve a sense of specialness. The test is not the intensity of the experience. The test is what happens after. If life becomes simpler, clearer, less burdened, then the channel was real. If life becomes more complicated, if you feel compelled to explain the experience, to convince others to chase it again, to turn it into a method, then it was noise. Real awareness does not leave you with homework. It leaves you lighter. In this healing phase, you will likely move through these channels without trying. Information will arrive through different routes depending on what is needed. And the most beautiful part is that you won't need to decode it the way you used to. You won't have to sit down and translate every sign into a story. The information comes with its own context, its own application. By the time you become consciously aware of it, it's already integrated. That is what it means to be stable enough to receive. Not that you receive more, but that what you receive can actually land without being distorted by your own interference. This is also why so many spiritual teachings sound correct but become useless when applied as commands. Let go, release, surrender. They point to the right direction, but they often omit the paradox. Trying to let go creates the tension you're trying to release. It is like trying to relax by ordering yourself to relax. The command itself tightens the body. The same mechanism operates at the level of consciousness. You cannot force yourself into readiness. You cannot manufacture stability through effort. Effort by its nature introduces strain, and strain fragments the observational field. Here is the paradox. At the heart of transformation, the moment you try to reach a state, you confirm that you are not already in it. That confirmation creates separation. Separation creates tension. Tension fractures the field. So you use the very mechanism that prevents arrival to try to arrive. For years, you may have been taught that change requires discipline, practice, commitment. In the material world, often it does. You build muscle by lifting consistently. You learn a language by practicing daily. But readiness, the kind you're touching now, is not built the same way. It is not an outcome you can force into existence. It is a condition that emerges when the system stops fighting itself. And the most precise way to describe what is happening now is not that you have become someone new. It is that you have become less interfered with, less hijacked by urgency, less compelled to interpret everything, less divided. The observer has steadied. The field is coherent enough to hold what life has been offering all along. So notice what this moment is made of: not excitement, not drama, not proof. Just a quiet capacity. A stable enough presence that the next step does not need to be hunted down. It can appear, can land. It can stay. You've arrived. And the arrival is not a destination. It is a posture, a way of being in which reality can meet you without scattering. A way of seeing that does not break itself into fragments the moment uncertainty appears. A way of receiving that does not turn every insight into a project, every feeling into a verdict, every pause into a problem. If you do nothing else, let that be enough. Let the quiet be meaningful without forcing it to be dramatic. Let the absence of urgency be the sign that something in you has stabilized. Let the healing complete itself the way the body heals, when you stop picking at the wound without fanfare, without effort, by returning to what is already whole. Linear progression works for linear goals. You can chart it, measure it, break it into steps, and watch the numbers move. You can build muscle that way. You can learn a language that way. You can train for a race that way. But consciousness does not operate as a straight line with checkpoints and badges. The observer does not improve through accumulation. It clarifies through subtraction. That is the part most people resist because subtraction feels like loss to a mind trained on achievement. The mind wants more insight, more practices, more frameworks, more proof. It wants to stack experiences like credentials. But in the domain you are touching now, the healing phase, the stabilization of the field, more is often just more interference. The real work is removing what keeps disrupting what is already whole. What needs to be subtracted is not your intelligence, your sincerity, or your desire to live well. What needs to be subtracted is the constant monitoring, the perpetual self-correction, the endless inner dialogue about whether you are doing it right, feeling it right, understanding it right. All of that can look like awareness. It can feel responsible, vigilant, conscious, but much of it is simply interference masquerading as maturity. You think you are staying awake by supervising every internal movement. You think you are being careful by scanning for mistakes. You think you are maintaining your progress by checking in every few minutes to confirm you still have it. Yet true stability does not require supervision. It does not need you to hold it in place with effort. A stable system self-regulates. It corrects without commentary. It returns to center without drama. And that is the moment you are approaching now, when you stop trying to maintain a state. The state that was always there beneath the effort reveals itself, not as something you achieved, but as what you have always been when you weren't trying to be anything. This is why the healing phase often feels like doing less, not more. It is not a regression. It is not laziness. It is not spiritual apathy. It is an intelligent quieting of unnecessary force. You stop meditating so hard. You stop affirming so desperately. You stop visualizing your desired reality with that strained intensity that secretly admits it isn't here yet. Not because you have given up, but because you finally recognize that the effort itself was creating noise, and the signal you were trying to hear was already present, waiting for the noise to stop. The mind hates this. The mind wants a method, a technique, a thing to do. Doing feels productive. Doing creates the illusion of control. And control has been one of the mind's primary strategies for safety. If you are doing something, you can tell yourself you are not helpless. If you are refining, optimizing, adjusting, you can tell yourself you are not stuck. But in consciousness, work doing is often the problem, not the solution. Because the more you do from that anxious place, the more you confirm that something is missing. And the more you confirm something is missing, the more your field fragments to search for it. Fragmentation is not just a concept. It is a lived experience. It feels like being pulled in multiple directions at once. It feels like effort with no traction. It feels like constantly evaluating yourself while trying to live. And the evaluation becomes its own form of disturbance, stirring the water while wondering why it won't clear. When you stop doing that particular kind of doing, a very specific kind of space opens up. Not empty space, available space. Space for information to arrive without being filtered through your agendas. Space for clarity to emerge without being shaped by your expectations. Space for reality to respond to what you actually are rather than what you are trying to become. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you stop taking action in your life. It means action begins to come from a different source. Not from the part of you that is trying to fix itself, improve itself, prove itself, protect itself. From the part that simply responds to what is present. That responsiveness is faster, cleaner, and more accurate than anything force could produce because it is not split. It is not arguing with itself as it moves. One of the earliest signs you are letting go of force is that decisions become simpler, not necessarily easier, but simpler. Simplicity is structural. It is clean. It is the dropping away of unnecessary mental weight. Overthinking fades. The obsessive weighing of pros and cons becomes less compulsive. You see an option and you either move toward it or you don't. And both responses feel clean. No second guessing. No negotiating with yourself. No extended internal trial where you prosecute and defend your own choices. Just movement or stillness, both equally valid. You will also notice that motivation changes texture. Before, motivation often felt like pushing yourself forward, dragging yourself through resistance with discipline and pressure. Now it begins to feel like permission to move. That distinction is not poetic, it is practical. Pushing creates resistance. Permission creates flow. When you push, you are fighting some part of yourself that does not want to go. When you permit the parts align, the movement becomes coherent. As this coherence develops, some directions that once seemed crucial will lose all energy. You won't have to stage an internal debate to stop pursuing them. They will simply fall away like dead leaves from a tree. No drama, no sense of failure, just a quiet recognition this path is no longer live. And other directions will open not because you went looking for them, but because you stopped blocking them with effort. This phase can still trigger panic in the mind. The mind will say, without constant effort, you will stagnate. You will lose ground. You will fall behind. This fear is not random. It is the voice of linear measurement, trying to control a non-linear domain. It is the part of you that believes progress must look like visible motion. It does not understand that consciousness moves in spirals, not lines. Integration is not always loud. What looks like stagnation on the surface is often integration at depth. Here is a hard truth that becomes liberating when you see it. Much of your previous stagnation came from trying too hard. You were so busy adjusting your approach, correcting your mistakes, optimizing your process, that nothing had time to settle. You kept stirring the water and calling it improvement. You kept reaching for the next tool and calling it progress. You kept adding more practices and calling it commitment. And beneath all of it was the same underlying message: this isn't enough yet. That message fractured the field. The healing phase is when you stop stirring. And clarity doesn't come because you found the perfect technique. It comes because you stopped applying techniques as a way to control your state. It comes because you stopped trying to manage the observer. This can feel disorienting at first. You are used to tracking your state, monitoring your progress, checking whether you are still on the path. When that compulsion fades, you might briefly feel lost, as if the map has disappeared. But you are not lost. For the first time, you are not following a map someone else drew. You are moving according to what is actually present, not according to what you think should be present. So take a moment, not as a practice, not as an assignment. Just a moment. Pause the need to understand this perfectly. Pause the urge to apply it immediately. Notice what it is like to be here without pressure to extract meaning. Can you read these words without turning them into a task? Can you allow this moment to be exactly as it is without improvement, if you can, even for a few seconds? That is the felt sense of non-forcing. That is what stability feels like. Not elevated, not special, not transformed. Simply here without resistance, without the need to be anywhere else. From that simple presence, everything else becomes possible. And this is where a subtle danger appears, not as punishment, but as habit. The moment a shift happens, the mind wants to grab it. It wants to hold it name. It turn it into an identity. It wants to say, this is me now. This is where most people lose what they have gained. Not because the shift wasn't real, but because they tried to own it. The moment you try to own a shift, you step out of the state that allowed it to occur. Think about the last time you felt truly clear. Maybe it was after a deep conversation. Maybe it was in nature. Maybe it arrived for no reason at all. You were suddenly present, aligned, uncomplicated. And then what happened? A thought arose. Is it? This is what I've been looking for. I need to remember this. I need to keep this. And the moment that thought arrived, the clarity began to fade. not because you did something wrong, but because you moved from experiencing to possessing. You moved from being the space where clarity exists to being someone who has clarity. And someone who has something must protect it, maintain, make sure it doesn't disappear. That protection creates the very fragmentation you are trying to avoid. You start monitoring your state, checking whether you are still clear, comparing this moment to the moment when you felt so aligned, wondering whether you were doing the right things to keep it alive. That monitoring is interference. The field fragments and the clarity you tried to preserve gets buried under the effort to preserve it. This is the trap of identification. When an experience becomes part of how you see yourself, it is no longer free to move. It gets frozen in time, turned into a memory you revisit, a standard you measure yourself against. I used to feel so clear. Why don't I feel that way now? What did I do differently back then? These questions seem innocent, even sincere. But they pull you out of presence and into an image of who you think you should be. They convert a living process into a fixed reference point. True shifts do not need to be remembered. They integrate so fully into how you operate that they become invisible. You do not think about breathing. You do not think about your heart beating. Those are integrated processes. And when a consciousness shift fully integrates, it becomes equally automatic. You do not reference it. You do not perform it. You simply live differently. And the difference shows in your choices, not in your stories. Here is how you know identification has formed you. Feel the need to tell people about the shift, not as natural sharing, but as a request for confirmation. You want acknowledgement. Yes, you've changed. Yes, you've grown. Yes, you are different. That need for validation is a sign the shift has not landed fully. It is still hovering at the level of concept, not embodiment. Another sign is more subtle. You begin to feel separate from those who haven't gotten it yet. You look at others and think, if they only understood what I understand, if they only saw what I see. Even when wrapped in compassion, that subtle superiority is the ego constructing a new identity. And any identity, especially a spiritual one, creates separation from others. Separation from what is separation, from the ordinariness that was emerging before the identity formed. The deepest shifts always return you to ordinariness. They do not make you special. They make you more human, more relatable, more comfortable with not knowing. If a shift makes you feel elevated above others, something has been misunderstood. The point was never to rise above life. The point was to stop fighting it. The point was never to become someone impressive. The point was to become coherent. So in this phase, let the subtraction continue, not as a project, but as a natural unwinding. Let the monitoring fade. Let the self-correction soften. Let the urge to possess your clarity dissolve. Allow the shift to become invisible by becoming embodied. Let it show up where it matters, in the simplicity of your decisions, in the cleanliness of your action, in the ease of being present without demanding that presence prove itself. This is the continuity of what you've arrived at, not a new identity to defend, but a stable field that can receive without distortion. Not a dramatic transformation you must maintain, but an ordinariness that does not require supervision. And as you stop trying to be ready, you discover the quiet fact beneath all effort: readiness was never manufactured. It was uncovered. The experience was real, but the interpretation has been hijacked by the part of you that needs to be someone. That distinction matters. Because when people hear, don't identify, what happened downplaying it, or that is not the invitation. Letting go of identification isn't rejection. It's not cynicism. It's not self-erasure. It is simply refusing to carry the experience forward as a badge, refusing to use it as proof of progress, refusing to reference it as a credential that confirms you are on track. When you stop doing that, something subtle but powerful happens. The shifts can return, but in a different form. less noticeable, less named, less theatrical, more integrated into the fabric of daily living, where transformation is supposed to live anyway. You find yourself making different choices without turning those choices into a philosophical event. You end conversations earlier when they no longer serve without needing to justify it. You walk away from dynamics that once hooked you and you don't even feel proud about it. You say no without guilt. You say yes without overexcitement. You stop bargaining with yourself. You stop narrating your motives. You simply act from what fits. These small adjustments are the real evidence of transformation, not the peak experiences, not the moments you could describe dramatically, but the 1,000 tiny recalibrations that happen when you're no longer performing a version of yourself. At this stage of the healing phase, the invitation is straightforward. Let the shifts be. Let moments of clarity come and go without trying to capture them. Let yourself change without announcing the change. Let growth happen so quietly that even you don't notice it, until months later when you look back and realize you are no longer living the same way. This is not about achieving a new fixed state. It is about becoming available to ongoing fluidity and ability to respond to life in real time without losing your center. That more than anything is what stability actually means. Not holding one particular mood or identity in place, but being flexible enough to move with what's arising without collapsing, without fragmenting, without reverting to supervision. So if you are listening to this and you feel like you are becoming less instead of more or less inflated, less certain, less invested in being impressive, that is not a problem. That is a positive sign. The inflation is leaving. The constructed spiritual identity is dissolving. And what remains when all of that falls away isn't nothing. It's the actual you, the one who doesn't need to have it figured out, doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, including yourself. From that humble, ordinary ground, real transformation becomes possible. Not because you are trying to transform, but because you have stopped preventing transformation by trying to own it. And this is where the mind often gets confused. Reality does not move at the speed of expectation. That is what creates most of the disorientation in the healing phase. You stabilize. You feel ready to receive. You sense something has shifted internally. And then nothing dramatic happens. No sudden windfall. No instant manifestation. No radical external restructuring on your preferred timeline. So the mind starts running its old diagnostic loop. Did I do something wrong? Am I actually ready? Was this just a story I told myself? But what is actually happening is quieter and more precise. Reality is responding, just not in the way you imagined and not on the schedule you demanded. The response comes first as reorganization, not as reward. What no longer fits begins to fall away. What does fit begins to reveal itself slowly, subtly, through opportunities you would have missed before because you were too busy looking for something bigger, louder, more convincing. You start noticing that the world is not responding. It's responding with edits, with refinements, with corrections that reduce noise in your life. The first change you will likely notice: how you approach decisions. Where you used to stand paralyzed by options, calculating, predicting, weighing every possibility, now you move through choices with surprising ease. Not because every choice feels obviously right, but because you're no longer pulled so violently by the secondary fears that used to dominate. Fear of missing out. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of what others will think. Fear of choosing the wrong timeline. Those fears may still arise, but they don't hijack the steering wheel anymore. They pass through like weather. And underneath them, you sense what actually fits for you in this moment. That sensing doesn't come with guarantees. It doesn't promise success, approval, or happiness. It simply indicates alignment. This way has energy, that way doesn't. And you trust the information enough to move. Reality responds to that trust, not always immediately, but cumulatively. Each time you honor the quiet knowing instead of overriding it with fear or compulsive logic, the field registers something important: you are listening. And slowly the feedback becomes more precise. Clearer signals, earlier warnings when you drift, faster confirmation when you are aligned. But here is where people often stumble. They expect reality to respond with additions. New opportunities, more abundance, better relationships, more doors opening. And sometimes it does, but more often reality responds first with subtractions. Things that were barely holding together finally break. Relationships that survived on momentum alone begin to drift apart. Jobs that tolerated your presence but did not truly value you become intolerable. Habits that you managed for years with denial start to show their cost. This can feel like loss. It can feel like regression. It can feel like the universe is taking something away when you are finally ready to receive. But this is not punishment. It is precision. Reality isn't removing things to teach you a lesson. It's removing what blocks clearer alignment. It's exposing what was built on instability. The mind conditioned to see loss as failure panics because it equates receiving with getting more. Yet sometimes receiving begins as relief from what was draining, you distorting, you scattering your attention. Sometimes the most generous response reality can give is the end of what you kept forcing to continue. Everything isn't falling apart. What wasn't built on stable ground is being revealed as such. And that revelation, while uncomfortable, is deeply productive, because space is not the same as emptiness. When something falls away, it leaves space. And space is a resource. Space allows for more precise movement. You are no longer navigating around structures that don't serve you. You are no longer spending energy maintaining situations that were quietly eroding you. The energy returns not as a dramatic surge, but as a simple noticing. You are less tired, less scattered, more available for what actually matters. Reality also responds through friction, and this confuses people because they assume alignment means everything should be effortless. But alignment doesn't remove resistance. It makes misalignment visible faster. Before, you might stay in a misaligned conversation for hours before noticing you felt drained. Now you feel the drain within minutes. That is not regression. That is increased sensitivity. Your system has become precise enough to detect incongruence early. And early friction is a gift. It allows you to course correct without massive loss. You do not invest months in a project before realizing it's off track. You do not stay in relationships years past their natural end. You feel the friction, you honor it, and you adjust. No drama, no blame, just gentle recalibration. There is another form of response that is easy to overlook because it doesn't feel supernatural. Synchronization. Not the romantic version where you think of someone and they call and you interpret it as magic. The practical version where the next step appears exactly when it is needed, but only after you complete the current step. You are not searching aggressively for opportunities, yet relevant ones present themselves. You are not forcing connections, yet meaningful encounters happen. You are not scripting outcomes, yet the sequence of events begins to feel organized in a way that makes sense. This does not feel miraculous. It feels reasonable, almost obvious, as if life has always been structured this way, and you simply weren't tuned to notice it because you were busy projecting your expectations onto it. The skeptical mind calls this coincidence. But coincidence repeated consistently across multiple domains becomes pattern. And pattern, when trusted, becomes navigation. As the responses become more consistent, something shifts in how you relate to time. Before, time may have felt like something chasing you. Pressure to act now or miss your chance. Urgency to figure it out before it's too late. A constant sense that you are behind, late, failing to keep pace with the timeline you think you should be living. In the healing phase, time starts to feel available. Not infinite, you still understand seasons, mortality, windows that open and close, but available. The frantic quality dissolves. You begin to sense your natural pace. Sometimes that pace is faster than you assumed. Sometimes it is slower, but it is yours, not borrowed from someone else's urgency, not imposed by external pressure. And when you move at your own pace, energy stops leaking. You are no longer overfunctioning in some areas to compensate for underfunctioning in others. You stop burning yourself out trying to be consistent with an identity rather than responsive to reality. This is where the earlier point about identification becomes crucial again. If you turn this phase into a narrative, I am someone who is aligned now, someone who receives now, someone who has stabilized you will recreate the same interference you just escaped. Because identities need maintenance. They need proof. They need repetition. They need defense. And defense fragments the field. Instead, the invitation is to let the reorganization happen without turning it into a story about you. Let the subtractions occur without calling them failure. Let the friction reveal misalignment without taking it personally. Let synchronization guide you without demanding that it look dramatic. Let time become available without using it as a new reason to optimize yourself. You are not being asked to believe in anything. You are being asked to notice what is already happening when you stop interfering. When you drop the need to be someone who has shifted, you become available to actually shift continuously. Not into a new fixed state, but into a living responsiveness. Your life begins to reorganize, not according to your fantasies, but according to coherence. And coherence has a simple signature. Things get simpler. Not always easier, not always pleasant at first, but simpler, cleaner, more direct, less tangled. If you are in this phase, expect the changes to arrive as small acts of integrity. A conversation you end sooner, a boundary you set without a speech, a habit you drop without announcing it, an opportunity you take because it fits, not because it makes you look like someone, a timeline you stop fighting. This is what readiness looks like when it becomes real. Not as a peak moment you can point to, but as a quieter life that doesn't require you to be someone in order to be here. And that is why the shifts can keep coming. Because you are no longer trying to own them. You are letting them integrate invisibly until they are simply the way you live. You do what fits when it fits, and you rest when rest is needed. You stop treating your life like a test you have to pass, and start treating it like a living system you can actually listen to. This is usually the point where other people begin to notice you've changed, not because you've announced it, not because you've posted a new identity, not because you've explained your process, but because your energy is different. You're less reactive, less available for drama, less interested in performing your awareness, more direct but not harsh, more boundaried but not defensive. There is a simplicity to you that wasn't there before, and the simplicity is not coldness. It is precision. It's the difference between someone who is constantly negotiating with themselves and someone who has stopped splitting their attention into competing agendas. The change shows up in micro behaviors: how quickly you end phone calls, how much you share in casual conversations, what you say yes to without hesitation, what you quietly decline without apology, how long you stay in conversations that begin to feel off, how early you notice your own internal contraction and how calmly you respond to it. Reality has responded not with a single dramatic event, but with 1,000 small adjustments that accumulate into a completely different trajectory. You are still living your life, still working, relating, functioning, showing up. But the internal experience has shifted from forcing to flowing, from managing to allowing, from controlling to responding. And the most important detail is this: you do not need to understand how it happened. You do not need to track every variable, decode every signal, explain every change. You simply notice that life feels different, lighter, more honest, less effortful. And that difference, unspoken and unclaimed, is among the most reliable signs that your healing phase is doing exactly what it was designed to do. When the internal timeline stabilizes, the external world does not suddenly announce that you've arrived. There is no single moment where everything clicks into place, and you know with absolute certainty that you are on track. What happens instead is subtle. And because it's subtle, most people miss it. They keep waiting for the big confirmation while living inside the very stability they've been seeking. One of the first indicators is the disappearance of urgency, not the disappearance of desire. You can still want things. You can still have intentions and directions you move toward. But the frantic undercurrent, the constant whisper of hurry up, or you'll miss it, goes quiet. You still move forward, but you're no longer running from the fear of being left behind. This shift changes daily life. Small tasks that once felt heavy with implication, replying to messages, making decisions, choosing what to focus on, become simple again. You respond when you respond. You decide when enough clarity has arrived. You focus on what is in front of you without constantly wondering if you should be doing something else instead. The background pressure that made everything feel consequential begins to dissolve, and what remains is a more accurate relationship with what actually matters. Alongside this comes a clearer sense of direction, but not the kind that looks like a 5-year plan. Not a detailed map of where you will be and who you will become. Direction in this phase is smaller, cleaner. You know where you are now, and you can sense the next step, just the next step, not the whole staircase. And it's enough. You are no longer trying to see the entire path before you allow yourself to move. That alone changes your relationship with uncertainty. Before, not knowing felt dangerous. It meant you might make the wrong choice, waste time, end up somewhere you didn't want to be. Uncertainty was treated as a threat. Now not knowing feels neutral. Some things are clear, some things aren't. The unclear parts don't trigger the same anxiety because you trust that clarity arrives when it is needed, not before. You stop demanding certainty as a prerequisite for movement. You start treating life as an unfolding sequence where timing is part of the information. Your information diet changes too. You consume less content, scroll less for perspectives, search less for the next insight, collect fewer frameworks, fewer teachings, fewer tools. Not because you've learned everything, but because you are no longer operating from deficit. You are not trying to fill a gap. When information is genuinely useful, you receive it. When it is just stimulation, you sense that earlier and move on. Discernment gets sharper. You can feel the difference between content that serves your current phase and content that simply excites your mind. This isn't judgment. You aren't labeling things as good or bad. You are simply more attuned to what fits and what doesn't. And what doesn't fit loses its pull naturally. The mind no longer has to wrestle itself away from noise because the system can register noise as noise without turning it into a decision. The emotional landscape shifts as well. Emotions still move through you. Sadness, joy, frustration, excitement, but their intensity becomes proportional to what is actually happening. Small disappointments don't spiral into narratives about your worth. Small wins don't inflate into proof that you finally made it. Things happen. You feel an appropriate response. The feeling moves through and completes itself. This proportionality is one of the clearest signs of timeline stability. When the observer is stable, emotional reactions match the actual significance of events. You are no longer amplifying or minimizing based on old patterns. You respond to what is not what your history trained you to assume it means. Another overlooked change is that the need to perform drops away. You stop trying to demonstrate that you're awake, evolved, conscious on the path. Not because you're hiding, but because there's nothing to prove. You don't need others to validate your state. You don't need to remind yourself that you've changed. The changes show up so naturally in behavior that you often don't notice them until an old trigger appears and you realize it didn't pull you in. You responded differently without planning to. You also become more comfortable with questions that have no immediate answer. Where you used to rush to fill gaps with speculation or planning, you can let questions sit. "I don't know yet" becomes a complete sentence, not a problem to solve. And in that space, around not knowing, actual answers have room to emerge when they're ready. The mind learns that uncertainty is not an emergency. It is a normal state of living. Time itself begins to feel different. Less like something chasing you, more like a medium. You move through at your own rhythm. You are still aware that windows open and close, that seasons change, that there is natural timing to things. But urgency no longer drives you. You don't feel like you are running out of time. You feel like you are inside time, working with it instead of against it. Your pace becomes more honest, and because it is honest, it becomes more sustainable. Effort changes texture too. You still work. You still focus. You still apply energy to projects and goals. But the effort is clean now, without the underlying strain of self-conflict. You are not pushing against yourself as you move. And when you are done working, you can actually release. You don't need hours of recovery from the internal warfare. You are not depleting yourself and then scrambling to refill. You are moving with energy that can be renewed because it is not leaking into unnecessary resistance. When friction appears in it, will you stop interpreting it as failure? You treat it as information. This direction isn't flowing. This conversation isn't serving. This approach isn't working. Friction becomes a signal rather than an indictment. And because you're listening earlier, you adjust earlier, more gently, with less loss. You are not avoiding discomfort, but you are also not grinding through misalignment to prove your commitment. You stop romanticizing endurance as virtue when endurance is simply your old pattern of overriding what you already know. Sometimes you look back and realize you handled a situation that would have destabilized you months ago, and this time you move through it with relative ease. Not because you're stronger in the way the mind imagines strength, but because you didn't fragment under pressure. The observer stayed whole. And when the observer stays whole, reality's feedback stays clear. You can navigate based on accurate information instead of reactive fear. None of these signs announce themselves. You won't wake up one morning and say, "My timeline has stabilized." You simply notice over time that you are living differently, less explanation, more action, less performance, more presence, less story, more movement. And that difference, quiet and unclaimed, is the evidence you are no longer in the same loop you were circling before. The healing phase does not end with a graduation ceremony. It ends when you stop tracking it, when you are so integrated into living from this new ground that there is no separate healing phase to reference anymore. It's just life now. And life lived from stable observation doesn't need to be named, celebrated, or protected. It continues quietly, precisely in rhythm with what is actually here. This is why the distinction between awareness and meaning-making matters so much. On the surface, they can look similar. Both can begin with a moment of clarity, a shift in perception and internal opening. But their effects are completely different. And the effect determines whether what you experience integrates or becomes another layer of conceptual identity. When awareness arises, it does not demand anything from you. There is no urgency to capture it, explain it, or fit it into your existing framework. Information lands and it sits there stable and available. You don't feel special. You don't feel like you've achieved something. You simply know something you didn't know before. And that knowing does not create pressure to act immediately. It is complete as it is. Meaning-making feels different. It begins with the same opening, and then the mind rushes in to complete a story. This means I'm finally getting it. This means I've reached a new level. This confirms I'm on the right path. That narrative construction, the need to place the experience into a framework of personal progress, is where awareness gets converted into ego fuel. And ego fuel always comes with maintenance. If you reached a new level, you must keep it. If you finally got it, you must prove it. If you're on the right path, you must protect it from doubt. That is how the field fragments again. A simple test helps. Does the experience resolve a question? Or does it multiply them? Real awareness resolves uncertainty. You may not yet know what to do with the information, but the inner tension that was created by the question dissolves. The wondering stops. Not knowing becomes comfortable. Meaning making does the opposite. It multiplies questions. What does this mean for my future? How do I keep this state? What should I do differently now? The more you explain, the more explanation is required. The mind builds a structure of interpretation that it then has to manage. Another marker is how you relate to language. When awareness is genuinely operating, there is often little impulse to share. Not because you are secretive, but because language feels insufficient. The experience completed itself internally. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't seek validation. But when meaning-making takes over, you feel compelled to tell the story, to describe what happened in a way that confirms it was significant, that makes others recognize you've changed, that proves the experience was real. That need for external confirmation signals that the shift has not landed yet. It is still conceptual, not embodied. True integration is largely wordless. It shows up in behavior, not declaration. You stop doing certain things without announcing that you're stopping. You start responding differently without explaining why. You don't need to persuade anyone, including yourself, that the shift occurred. Because the shift is not something you have. It is something you are living. And this is the continuity of your trajectory. Now your life begins to reorganize through small, precise changes that you do not need to narrate. You do what fits when it fits, and you rest when rest is needed. You move at your own pace without the frantic undercurrent of proving. You allow awareness to land without converting it into identity. You distinguish signal from stimulation. You let integration be quiet. That quietness is not absence. It is stability. It is the field no longer collapsing into performance. It is the observer staying whole. And from that wholeness, your life keeps changing gently, continuously, accurately, without needing a story to make it real. The change is so natural that even you barely notice it until much later. That is one of the quiet signatures of real integration. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't demand that you narrate it. It simply alters what you do. And the behavioral impact is where awareness and meaning-making diverge most clearly. Awareness simplifies how you act. It reduces unnecessary conversations. It creates earlier exits from situations that don't serve. It makes your use of time and energy more selective, not through discipline, but through an almost effortless clarity. These adjustments happen organically. There is no internal negotiation, no extended self-talk, no dramatic vow to be different. You just find yourself behaving differently because the internal fragmentation that used to require over-explanation has softened. Meaning-making does the opposite. It tends to create performative behavior. It changes how you present yourself, how you speak, how you signal to others and to yourself, who you believe you've become. You start curating an image of growth. You become subtly invested in being seen as conscious, evolved, clear, aligned. And performance always requires maintenance. Anything requiring constant maintenance is not stable. It may look impressive, but it is structurally fragile. It cannot rest. It cannot self-regulate. It has to be held in place. Here's what the mind does brilliantly. It builds frameworks that sound completely reasonable. It creates explanations that feel true. It constructs meaning that seems to fit. It uses language as scaffolding and calls it understanding. But reasonable does not equal accurate. The mind can justify almost anything if it serves the need to feel like progress is happening. That is why real awareness does not need reasonableness. It needs operational consistency. A clean metric exists here, and it is not philosophical. Does life actually get lighter, Do contradictions reduce? Is there less internal friction? Is there less looping, less self-conflict, less tension around ordinary choices? If yes, awareness is present. If no, you may be living inside a well-constructed story of awareness meaning, making that sound sophisticated but doesn't change how you operate. One of the subtlest differences between awareness and meaning-making is what happens to self-monitoring. When awareness integrates you, track your state less frequently. You stop checking in every few minutes to evaluate yourself. Am I still clear? Am I losing it? Am I doing this? Right. You return to living. And within that living clarity expresses itself through ordinary moments. How you answer a message, how you choose a meeting, how you set a boundary without a speech. Meaning-making increases self-observation. You become hyper-aware of how you are doing. You constantly measure yourself against an internal image of who you think you should be. One part of you lives while another part watches and grades the living. That split attention can feel like self-awareness, but it is usually fragmentation disguised as consciousness. It looks refined, but it keeps you divided. None of this means imagination is the enemy. Imagination serves creativity, vision, possibility. It's a powerful tool. The problem emerges when imagination fills in what isn't clear yet, when it completes the story before reality finishes unfolding. Awareness can hold not knowing without discomfort. Meaning-making needs any answer to resolve the tension of uncertainty. So the mind fabricates meaning to soothe itself, and that fabricated meaning becomes a filter. It distorts everything that comes after because you're no longer responding to what is. You're responding to what your story says is happening. As you become more skilled at distinguishing the two, a new capacity develops. You start catching yourself right before the mind completes the story. Not to stop it by force, not to wage war on your thoughts, but to recognize the movement early enough that you can pause. And in that pause, the compulsion to explain usually fades on its own. You don't have to fight your imagination. You just stop letting it lead. That shift, imagination becoming supportive rather than directive, is a major pivot. It changes your internal climate. You interpret less and live more. Not because you're becoming unconscious or indifferent, but because you're trusting reality's self-correcting nature. When coherence is maintained, you don't need to assign significance to every fluctuation. Some experiences matter, some don't. Some leave traces, some pass cleanly through. Not everything has to become part of your personal mythology. This creates a specific kind of freedom. You are no longer carrying yourself as a project under construction. You're not constantly measuring where you are on some imagined path. The path continues, but it doesn't require constant evaluation. You stop auditing your life. You stop treating each emotional wave as evidence for or against your progress. You stop turning the present moment into a referendum on your future. Awareness doesn't accumulate. It updates. That's a crucial distinction. Accumulation adds layers. It creates complexity. Updating clarifies the present. It doesn't add more concepts. It removes what was obscuring direct perception. This is why mature awareness often looks simpler over time, not more elaborate. You become less interested in collecting explanations and more interested in living with precision. Precision is not dramatic. It doesn't create stories worth telling. It simply fits. It works. It reduces friction, and that reduction in friction is worth more than 1,000 transcendent moments that do not change how you move through daily existence. If you find yourself less attracted to promises of deeper, higher, more intense experiences, that is not spiritual boredom. It is a sign you're starting to value baseline precision over peak states. Peak states can be beautiful, but if they don't integrate, they become addictive. They become something you chase, something you use to validate yourself. Baseline precision changes everything quietly: how you speak, how you choose, how you rest, how you respond when things don't go as planned. Awareness doesn't need protection from imagination. It only needs not to be interfered with. When left alone, it stands on its own foundation. And when it stands, it stops needing names, labels, and explanations. The question at this point in your healing shifts from, "What did I just experience?" to something more operational. Is life operating with less resistance? If the answer is yes, awareness is doing its work. If the answer is no, you may be spending too much energy maintaining the story of awareness instead of living from it. That does not diminish the journey. It makes it real. It brings it out of concept and into function. Real shifts don't require belief. They don't require memory. They don't require you to hold on to them. They integrate so completely into how you function that they become invisible. And invisible shifts, the ones that leave no trace except changed behavior, are the only ones that last. This is where the mind's most common trap appears. Especially, the mind's first instinct is to claim ownership, to convert the experience into identity. This is the trap that catches almost everyone, and it happens so smoothly that you don't realize you've stepped into it until weeks later, when you notice you're performing a version of yourself instead of living as yourself. Here is how it happens. Something shifts. You feel clearer, calmer, more present than you felt in a long time. And immediately, a thought arises. I'm someone who's clear now. I'm someone who gets it. I've reached a new level. The thought seems harmless. It even seems accurate. But the moment you identify with the shift, you stop being in the state that allowed it and start being someone who had that state. And someone who had something must now maintain it, must protect it, must make sure they don't lose it. That protective stance creates tension. Tension fragments the field. Then monitoring begins. Am I still clear? It doesn't keep the clarity alive. It disrupts the conditions that allowed clarity to arise. The shift itself was real. The clarity was genuine. But the moment you turned it into my clarity proof of progress, a marker of who you are, you stepped out of direct experience and into a conceptual relationship with the experience. And concept always invites management. Management always invites monitoring. Monitoring invites fragmentation. Fragmentation invites the very instability you thought you had left behind. So the invitation is not to distrust your experiences. It is to stop turning them into possession. Let the clarity be a movement, not a trophy. Let the shift be a reorganization, not a personal brand. Let awareness do what it naturally does when it is not hijacked, simplify, reduce friction, update perception, and quietly change behavior without requiring you to announce that anything has changed. If you can hold that, if you can let the mind's ownership impulse pass without feeding it, then the healing phase deepens in the most reliable way possible. Not by becoming more impressive, but by becoming more stable. Not by collecting bigger moments, but by living with fewer distortions. Not by performing awakening, but by operating with less resistance, one ordinary choice at a time. Conceptual relationships can't sustain what was lived. A moment of genuine clarity can exist complete and clean, and then the mind turns it into an object, something to hold, interpret, and carry forward. But once it becomes an object, it enters the domain of ownership, and ownership immediately invites maintenance. That is where the shift starts to thin out, not because it wasn't real, but because the relationship to it changed. What was lived became something you now try to possess. One of the clearest signs that identification has formed is the impulse to tell people about the shift. Not natural sharing, not a spontaneous conversation where something honest comes through, but the specific need to describe what happened in a way that gets others to confirm it was significant. You want witnesses. You want acknowledgement that, yes, you've changed. Yes, you're different. Yes, what happened to you matters. And the moment that need becomes central, it reveals something important. The shift is being held at the identity level, not integrated at the being level. Integration doesn't require witnesses. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't seek validation. It is satisfied by function. It shows itself in behavior. Identification, by contrast, needs to be seen. It needs to be recognized, mirrored, back affirmed. It wants the world to reflect the new self-image so the mind can feel secure that the change is real. But awareness that needs confirmation is still fragile. It is still conceptual. It is still something you are trying to keep. Another indicator that identification has formed is subtler and in some ways more corrosive. You start feeling separate from people who haven't seen what you've seen. You notice their patterns, their struggles, their unconscious behaviors, and a thought arises, if they only understood what I understand now. That sense of being ahead, even when wrapped in compassion, often becomes ego creating a new form of separation. And separation always fragments the field. The observer becomes divided. Here is me, here are them. Here is clarity. There is confusion. Here is awake, there is asleep. The field is no longer unified. It is classified. It is ranked. It is filtered through identity. The deepest shifts don't elevate you. They return you to humanity. They make you more ordinary, not more special. More comfortable with not knowing. More at ease with being wrong. More available for the full range of human experience without needing to transcend any of it. If a shift makes you feel like you're on a different level than others, something has been misunderstood. The experience might have been real, but the interpretation got captured by the part of you that needs to be someone. Letting go of identification isn't about rejecting what happened. It's about not carrying it forward as a trophy, not referencing it to prove you're on track, not using it to confirm you're one of the people who gets it. When you stop feeding the identity, it dissolves naturally. And when it dissolves, something remarkable happens. The clarity can return, but in an integrated form, less dramatic, less named, more woven into the fabric of how you simply are. This is where many people misread the process. At this stage of healing, you might find yourself feeling more ordinary, less special, with less to say about your journey. The mind interprets this as regression. I was doing so well. What happened? Why don't I feel transformed anymore? But what's actually occurring is a return to flexibility, a return to not needing an image to protect, a return to being allowed to not know, to be confused, to make mistakes without it meaning you've lost your progress. These are signs of health, not failure. When you can be uncertain without panic, when you can be wrong without shame, when you can be ordinary without feeling like you've lost something precious, that is when identity has loosened its grip. And when identity loosens, you stop carrying the shift as something separate from yourself. It becomes how you live, unnamed, unmentioned, but present in every small choice. True transformation asks you to subtract, not add. Each layer of identity that falls reveals more of what was always there underneath the performance, more simplicity, more directness, more capacity to respond to what is present, instead of what you think should be present based on who you're trying to be. When there's no identity left to defend, observation returns to its natural ground. And from that ground, you can move through life without the constant weight of maintaining an image. You can change without announcing it. You can grow without tracking it. You can live without needing to prove to yourself or anyone else that you're living correctly. And this is the part almost no one tells you. That's when the real receiving begins. Not when you're trying to be ready, not when you're performing readiness, but when you stop trying altogether and you're simply here, available with no agenda except to respond honestly to what life presents. That is the healing phase at its fullest. That is the ground from which everything else becomes possible. The completion you're looking for won't arrive as a definitive moment. There will be no ceremony, no certificate, no clear boundary between healing phase and healed. What you'll notice instead, probably months from now, is that you stopped asking whether you were still in it. The question became irrelevant, not because you found an answer, but because the question itself completed its function and dissolved. This completion doesn't carry triumph. It carries precision. You won't feel like you achieved something monumental. You will simply realize you are no longer efforting to hold yourself in any particular state. The questions that once drove you, am I doing this right? Am I far enough along? Am I finally, there will have lost their charge. Not because you answered them, but because they stopped being necessary. Life doesn't shrink when this happens. It gets closer. Ordinary moments begin revealing a depth you overlooked before. A morning that holds nothing remarkable, yet nothing wrong. A conversation that isn't profound, but isn't false either. A workday that doesn't drain you, but doesn't excite you, and that's perfectly fine. You stop needing peak experiences to confirm you're living correctly. Alignment shows up in the smallest details, and those details don't require commentary. As your presence stabilizes here, something shifts in how you trust. Not blind faith, not magical thinking, but trust built from repeated experience. When you don't interfere prematurely, information arrives exactly when it's needed. Not before, which would create overwhelm. Not after, which would create crisis. Right on time. You've watched this sequence enough times that you stop second-guessing the timing. You don't need to see 10 steps ahead anymore. You only need clarity for the next one, and consistently. That is what arrives. Stop here, continue there. Say no to this, say yes to that. The instructions are simple, almost too simple, which is why most people overlook them while searching for complex guidance. But simple accumulates. Small, clear choices made repeatedly over time create entirely different trajectories. You also begin to notice something else. What exhausted you was not always the difficulty of your tasks. Much of your fatigue came from constant self-correction. The perpetual internal negotiation. The exhausting maintenance of being who you thought you should be. When that maintenance ends, energy returns. Not in dramatic surges, but as sustainable availability. You can engage fully and then release fully without that residue of incompletion that used to linger for days. You don't carry the invisible weight of arguing with yourself after every interaction. Your relationships shift too, not through withdrawal, but through clarity. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself, convince others, or defend your choices. When alignment is present, you stay. When it isn't, you leave earlier and with less guilt. Relationships stop being places to confirm your worth and become spaces to simply be present together. That doesn't create distance, it creates authenticity. The absence of performance becomes a form of intimacy. Uncertainty becomes less threatening. You can move forward without guarantees. You can make choices without knowing if they're perfect. You can commit to directions while staying open to adjustment. This isn't recklessness. It's fluidity. You respond to feedback in real time rather than trying to predict and control everything in advance. Mistakes still happen, but you recognize them faster. Corrections become lighter. Consequences don't compound the way they used to because you don't keep doubling down to protect an identity. If you look back over the whole arc, you'll see that nothing was actually added to you. No new powers, no secret upgrades, no elevated form of consciousness that required you to become someone else. Just layers of interference gradually falling away. Each layer that dropped made life slightly simpler. And that simplicity isn't poverty, it's precision. It allows your energy to go where it's actually needed instead of scattering across the maintenance of images, states, and stories. True completion feels open, not closed. open to days that don't require meaning, open to choices that don't need theoretical justification, open to living without constantly auditing whether you're doing it right. When the foundation stabilizes, that question disappears. And when it disappears, you don't feel incomplete. You feel light. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you responsive. You're no longer pushed by fear or pulled by fantasy. You respond to what is present. And because you're responding to what's actually there, rather than what you wish were there, you drift less. Not because you're more disciplined, but because you're no longer chasing directions that were never yours to begin with. At a certain point, there's nothing left to pursue internally. That doesn't mean life loses depth. Depth stops being found by going inward endlessly and starts being found by staying with what's happening without distorting it. You don't need to separate from life to observe it. You observe while living. Awareness continues without effort, without maintenance, without the fear that you'll lose it if you look away. This completion doesn't ask for remembrance. It doesn't need to be preserved or repeated. It maintains itself naturally as long as you don't return to the habit of self-interference. And even when you do return to it occasionally, because nothing is permanently lost. You simply notice the interference earlier and stop, not to return to a special state, but to return to the ground that has been there all along. What remains isn't a conclusion. It's a way of being, living with less noise, fewer stories, less need for validation, and more clarity in the 1,000 small choices that actually shape a life. When you live this way, no one needs to announce that the healing phase is complete. There's nothing left to complete, only presence continuing quietly, precisely, exactly as needed for reality to meet you where you are. And from this ground, the next shift, if it comes, won't be about becoming more impressive, more advanced, more separate. It will be about becoming even more available, less interested in identity, less compelled to narrate, more able to meet what arises without pre-interpretation. That is the direction of real stabilization, not upward into specialness, but inward into simplicity that can hold everything.